Hey everyone, we're working hard to get our first 1,000 subscribers, sign up and you won't regret it. I hadn't seen Madison in almost 8 months. Not in the way a person sees an ex-wife on purpose, anyway. In that time, she'd managed to stay present without being present, through emails from her attorney, through screenshots forwarded by mutual friends who didn't know when to stop, through the occasional late-night call that rang once and went dead like a dare. So when I walked into family court on a rainy Tuesday and saw her sitting at the petitioner's table, I felt that old, stupid instinct to look for the familiar details. Same sleek hair. Same posture like she owned the room. Different body. Madison was pregnant. Not maybe pregnant. Not she gained weight pregnant. She had that unmistakable curve pushing against her blazer, round and deliberate, like it had been built for a photo shoot. And she wasn't hiding it. She angled herself so the belly showed from every direction. Hands folded right under it. Chin high. A quiet little performance that said, "Look at what you did to me." My first thought wasn't even jealousy. Or anger. It was numbers. Because divorce turns your life into a spreadsheet, and pregnancy, especially one that could be argued as mine, turns that spreadsheet into a hostage situation. I took my seat next to my attorney, Ms. Patel, and tried to keep my face neutral. I'd promised myself I wouldn't give Madison the satisfaction of watching me react. Ms. Patel leaned slightly toward me and murmured that we were going to stick to the facts. She didn't ask me if it was mine, because she already knew the timeline. Madison and I had been separated for over a year. She filed the moment she found out I'd stopped paying for her business coaching and her wellness retreats, which were basically expensive vacations with a different label. She moved out. I stayed in the house because my name was on the mortgage and she didn't want it anyway. Too many bad memories, she said, which was convenient because she also didn't want the responsibility. The case had dragged, like they always do when one person wants closure and the other wants leverage. Today was supposed to be simple, a hearing on final support numbers and division of assets. That was the plan. Then Madison walked in with a baby bump. And suddenly everything felt like it was shifting under my feet. The bailiff called the room to order. The judge entered, an older man with the kind of calm, tired face that made you believe he'd seen every human trick there was. He sat down, scanned the paperwork, and looked out over both tables. Madison's attorney, a silver-haired guy with a polished voice, did most of the talking. He framed Madison as a woman who'd sacrificed her career, her health, and her future earning potential to support my success. He spoke like Madison had been quietly suffering in a shadow I'd cast. When it was my turn, Ms. Patel kept it blunt. Our marriage had been short. We both worked. Madison's sacrifices were exaggerated. Her spending was documented. My offers to settle had been reasonable. The court had the bank statements, the receipts, the timeline. The judge listened without much expression. But Madison? Madison didn't listen. She watched me. Every time her attorney said, "financial hardship," she touched her belly. Every time "stability" came up, she smoothed her blazer. It was subtle, but it wasn't subtle. It was a reminder. I'm carrying a baby. I'm fragile. I'm protected. You're the villain. At one point, the judge asked a procedural question about updated financial disclosures. Madison's attorney answered quickly, then, almost as an afterthought, mentioned the pregnancy. He didn't make a big speech about it. He didn't have to. It landed in the room like a weight. The judge's eyes lifted, and for the first time, he really looked at Madison. Not her lawyer. Not the papers. Her. Madison shifted into what I remembered as her winning expression, soft eyes, lips pressed together like she was holding back emotion, shoulders slightly rounded like she needed comfort. I had seen that expression work on flight attendants, realtors, waiters, even my own mother. It was Madison's favorite costume. The judge asked a question about the date of separation, then glanced down at the file again. He tapped a pen against the desk as if lining up the math. My stomach tightened. In most states, if a woman is pregnant during divorce proceedings, the court can pause the final divorce until after the child is born, because paternity and child support have to be resolved. It's meant to protect the child. It can also be used to trap someone. Madison knew that. Madison counted on that. I looked sideways at Ms. Patel. Her jaw was set. She was already planning countermoves. Madison's attorney continued, pushing for increased temporary spousal support, higher monthly payments, to ensure prenatal care and stability. I didn't need to hear the unspoken part. If the baby was mine, or if Madison could make the court treat it like it might be mine, then I wasn't just paying to end a marriage. I was paying to fund Madison's next life. The judge held up a hand. The room went still. He looked directly at Madison, and his voice stayed even, almost gentle. He said he needed to clarify one thing before he could consider any adjustments. Madison leaned forward a fraction, like she was about to receive sympathy. Then the judge asked the question. Not about money. Not about cravings or doctor visits. Not even about whether I was the father. He asked for one specific detail, a detail so basic, so unavoidable, that if she didn't have it, the entire performance collapsed. Madison's face shifted. Not dramatically. Just enough. Like a mask slipping when the string snaps. And for the first time all morning, she didn't look at me like I was losing. She looked like she'd miscalculated. I didn't hear the judge's question as words at first. I heard it as a change in Madison's breathing. That small, involuntary pause that happens when someone expects a warm embrace and gets a cold hand on their shoulder. Then it clicked. The judge wanted her prenatal documentation. Not a sob story. Not a vague claim. Not a dramatic gesture. He asked for her OB's name, the due date, and proof of pregnancy in the form the court could accept, medical records or an affidavit. It was so simple. So boring. And it was exactly the kind of thing a person with a real pregnancy would be ready for, especially if they were using that pregnancy as a legal argument. Madison's attorney started talking fast, explaining that the pregnancy was recent, that they didn't anticipate needing to present medical documents at a support hearing, that they could provide it later. The judge didn't get angry. He didn't raise his voice. He just didn't budge. He said the court couldn't treat pregnancy as a factor without verification. He said it would be irresponsible to do otherwise. Then he asked again, calmly, like he was giving her another chance. Madison's attorney turned slightly toward her, and I watched his confidence falter. That was the first crack I'd seen in him the entire case. Madison stared down at the table for a second too long. Her hands, which had been resting so perfectly under her belly, shifted. She gripped her own fingers, hard. Finally, she offered something, an explanation that sounded like she'd rehearsed it in a mirror but hadn't expected to say it under fluorescent lights. She said she'd had an appointment scheduled. She said she hadn't gotten the paperwork yet. She said her doctor's office was being difficult. She said she'd provide what the court needed. The judge nodded once and made a note. Then he asked the next question. He asked why she'd written, in a signed filing from 2 months earlier, that she was not pregnant and had no dependents or expected dependents, despite now presenting the pregnancy as a central factor in support. The room tightened again. I could almost feel the air change. Because now it wasn't just a question of proof. It was a question of truth. Ms. Patel didn't interrupt. She didn't need to. The judge had pulled the thread himself. Madison's attorney tried to frame it as an innocent update. Circumstances change. New information becomes available. They didn't intend any misrepresentation. But the judge's gaze stayed on Madison, not on her lawyer. Madison's face had a sheen to it, too polished, too controlled. The expression she used on strangers didn't work here. It wasn't built for someone who could read a file. She offered another explanation, and it was the kind people use when they think confidence can replace details. She claimed she had only recently found out. The judge paused. Then he asked her how far along she was. I didn't see her belly move, but I saw Madison's throat tighten when she swallowed. She gave a number. And it wasn't a number you say casually if you've been to even one real prenatal appointment. It sounded guessed. The judge didn't argue. He didn't correct her. He just wrote something down. Then, without theatrics, he said the court would not consider the pregnancy in support calculations until proof was submitted. He set a deadline. He moved on. And Madison, who had walked in like she expected to leave with a check, suddenly had nothing to perform with. But the damage was already done. Because I didn't miss what the judge missed. When Madison answered how far along she was, she glanced, just for a second, toward her attorney like she wanted confirmation. Like she'd forgotten the script. I leaned slightly toward Ms. Patel and asked, under my breath, if she thought it was fake. Ms. Patel didn't answer immediately. She watched Madison with the same expression she'd used while reading Madison's financial disclosures, focused, slightly disgusted, emotionally detached. Then she said it didn't matter what she thought. It mattered what we could prove. I understood that, but my mind was already racing backward through the last year. Madison had left quickly, but not quietly. She'd told people I was controlling. She'd implied there were reasons she couldn't talk about. She'd acted like she was protecting herself, when really she was building a story. And every story Madison built had the same shape. She would position herself as the harmed one. Then she'd demand compensation for surviving me. When the judge took a short recess, Madison stood slowly, like the weight of the world was on her pelvis. It was too theatrical. Too timed. She walked past me with that practiced carefulness, and I noticed something I hadn't noticed before. The belly sat high and firm under her blazer. Not the way a body naturally settled when someone moved. It didn't sway. It didn't shift. It looked placed. I hated myself for thinking it, because the idea was insane. But Madison had done insane things when money was involved. A year ago, she'd tried to open a credit card in my name after we separated, claiming she forgot it wasn't her information anymore. She'd cried when I confronted her. She'd acted wounded that I would even accuse her. She'd always made the accusation the problem, not the action. In the hallway, I saw her speaking urgently to her attorney. He was nodding, but his eyes were sharper now, scanning the room like he was calculating risk. Ms. Patel pulled me aside and said we were going to request verification immediately. Not just because of the money. Because if Madison was lying to the court, and she'd put it in filings, and she'd done it knowingly, then we weren't in divorce court anymore. We were in fraud territory. I should have felt relief. Instead, I felt something darker. Because Madison didn't do things halfway. If she brought a fake pregnancy into a courtroom, it meant she'd already planned for the possibility of being challenged. Which meant she probably had a backup. And Madison's backups were never harmless. When we were called back in, the judge addressed the financial issues first. He kept the numbers closer to what Ms. Patel had argued. He rejected Madison's request for increased temporary support. He set the next hearing date for finalization, pending submission of the pregnancy documentation. Madison sat there with her hands in her lap now. No belly touching. No soft victim posture. Just stillness. And her eyes, those same eyes that used to look at me like I was her home, were flat. When court adjourned, Madison didn't leave right away. She waited until the room started to clear. Then she walked toward me. Her attorney followed a few steps behind, like he didn't want to be seen controlling her but also didn't trust her alone. Madison stopped close enough that I could smell her perfume, something expensive and overly sweet, like it had been sprayed to announce status. She said something quietly that I won't repeat word for word, but the message was clear. She wanted me to settle. She wanted money now. She implied the pregnancy made it urgent. She implied I didn't want the court to get messy. I didn't answer. Because the longer I stared at that belly, the more I felt sure of one thing. Whatever she was doing, it wasn't about a baby. It was about forcing my hand. And I wasn't the one who was going to blink first. That night, I went home and opened a folder I hadn't touched in months. Not financial documents. Not court filings. A folder of screenshots and notes from the last year, things I'd saved because Ms. Patel told me to document everything, even when it felt paranoid. And tucked between them was something I'd forgotten I even had. A voicemail from Madison, left late one night weeks after she moved out. She'd been angry. She'd been careless. And she'd said one line that, at the time, sounded like bitterness. Now, after seeing her in court with that belly and that smile and that sudden panic under the judge's questions, the line sounded like a blueprint. I replayed it 3 times. Then I called Ms. Patel. And I told her we needed to move faster. Ms. Patel answered on the second ring, which told me she was already thinking about my case. I didn't try to sound dramatic. I just told her what I'd found, an old voicemail. Madison's voice slurred slightly like she'd been drinking, bragging in that cruel way she had when she thought she was untouchable. In it, she'd basically admitted she could drag this out and make it cost me if I didn't give her what she wanted. And then she'd said the line. Not about love. Not about regret. About leverage. She'd said she could walk into court with whatever story she needed. At the time, I dismissed it as rage. Madison used words like weapons, sometimes she swung wildly. Now it sounded like a confession. Ms. Patel told me to forward the voicemail and any related messages immediately. She said we were going to file a motion requesting verification of pregnancy and, if necessary, a court-ordered medical confirmation. She warned me that courts don't love turning divorce hearings into circus investigations, but they love even less being played. I asked her if Madison could just be pregnant and still be lying in other ways. Ms. Patel said yes. She said people do it all the time, half-truths, timing games, selective facts. Then she said something that made my throat tighten. She said if Madison had knowingly misrepresented a pregnancy to influence support, the judge could sanction her. In extreme cases, it could become a criminal issue. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt tired. Because the best-case scenario was that Madison was lying and would get caught. The worst-case scenario was that she wasn't lying, and the child would tether me to her life for the next 18 years, whether I wanted it or not. Either way, I wasn't sleeping. Over the next week, we moved like we were racing a clock Madison had set. Ms. Patel filed the motion. Madison's attorney responded with an objection that was heavy on indignation and light on specifics. He framed it as harassment, as me trying to shame a pregnant woman, as cruelty. Ms. Patel didn't take the bait. She stuck to process. If pregnancy was being used as a factor in support, the court needed confirmation. That was it. Then something odd happened. Madison started posting. She hadn't posted much during the divorce, probably because her attorney had warned her not to. But suddenly, she was back on social media with carefully framed photos, loose sweaters, hands under belly, close-up shots of mocktails and prenatal vitamins, placed neatly on a counter. It wasn't subtle. It was a public narrative being built in real time. And the comments were exactly what she wanted: sympathy, outrage at me, vague statements about karma. I stayed off it. Ms. Patel warned me again not to engage. But I watched the posts the way you watch a storm build. Because in the middle of her new, glowing mom story, I noticed a detail that didn't fit. She posted a photo of herself in a full-length mirror. Side profile. Belly prominent. One hand under it, one hand holding the phone. In the reflection, her blazer hung open. And along the seam of the belly, near the waistband of her pants, there was a faint edge. A line that didn't match fabric or skin. It looked like the outline of something worn under clothing. I showed it to Ms. Patel. She didn't claim it proved anything. She just said to archive it. Save everything. So I did. And the more I saved, the more Madison's story started to look like a stage set. She never posted an ultrasound photo. Never posted a doctor's office wristband. Never posted anything that couldn't be faked with props and angles. Then, 2 days before the court deadline to submit her documentation, Madison deleted everything. All of it. The glowing posts. The mocktail shot. The mirror selfie. Gone. People don't erase joy unless they're trying to erase evidence. Ms. Patel filed a notice with the court the same day, pointing out that Madison had failed to provide any documentation by the deadline and requesting the court address it at the next hearing. Madison's attorney suddenly became harder to reach. Which, to me, meant one of two things. Either Madison was scrambling to create proof, or she was planning her escape route. The next hearing came fast. I walked into the courtroom ready for the usual numbers and arguments, but the atmosphere was different. The judge's clerk moved with a sharper efficiency. The judge looked less patient, more precise. Madison arrived late. She still had the belly. But it looked different. Lower. Softer. Less perfect. She sat down and kept her hands on the table instead of cradling herself. Her attorney was sweating. Not metaphorically. He had that sheen on his forehead like he'd run upstairs. The judge started with the pregnancy issue immediately. He asked, directly, whether Madison had provided proof. Madison's attorney said yes. Then he handed something to the clerk. I watched the judge read it. And I watched his expression change. Not anger. Not shock. Recognition. Like he'd seen this exact trick before. He looked up at Madison and asked her another question, again, calm and procedural, but the room leaned in because you could feel the trap closing. He asked her to confirm the name of the medical provider listed on the document. Madison answered quickly, too quickly. Then the judge asked her to spell it. Madison hesitated. Just a beat. But it was enough. The judge looked down again. Then he asked her where the clinic was located. Madison gave a city. The judge paused, and the pen in his hand stopped moving. Because the city she said didn't match the clinic listed. And that kind of mistake doesn't happen if you've actually been there. Madison's attorney started to speak, but the judge raised a hand and stopped him. Then the judge leaned forward, and his voice stayed steady. He said the court had concerns about the authenticity of the documentation. He said the court was going to ask one final question before deciding what to do next. Madison's eyes widened a fraction. And I felt something cold roll through my chest, because I realized what Madison had done. She didn't just bring a belly into court. She brought a piece of paper she thought would make it untouchable. The judge asked the question. It wasn't about the due date. It wasn't about the clinic. It was about the one thing that separates a real medical record from something cooked up on a laptop. He asked whether Madison would consent, right then, to the court ordering a verification directly from the provider. A simple release. A routine HIPAA authorization. If the record was real, signing it would be annoying but harmless. If it wasn't real, signing it would be fatal. Madison didn't answer. She stared at the paper like it had betrayed her. Her attorney leaned toward her, whispering urgently. And for the first time since this divorce began, Madison looked small. Not fragile. Small, like someone who finally realized the room wasn't full of people she could charm. The judge waited. Then he said if she refused, the court would draw an inference. He said he would also consider sanctions for misrepresentation. Madison's mouth opened slightly. She looked at her attorney. Then she looked at me. And in that moment, I saw something I hadn't seen in her in years. Fear. Because Madison didn't have a backup for the truth. Not when the judge could reach past her story and touch reality directly. She finally spoke. And she didn't say yes. She didn't say no. She tried to pivot, tried to claim it was invasive, tried to claim she was being attacked, tried to paint herself as the victim again. But the judge didn't move. He repeated the question. Consent or refusal? Madison's hands went to her belly. And as she shifted in her chair, the blazer pulled tight. That faint seam line I'd seen in her mirror photo appeared again, clearer under the courtroom lights. Ms. Patel saw it too. I knew she did because her eyes narrowed. The judge looked at Madison for a long moment. Then he said he was ordering a brief recess. He told Madison to confer with counsel. He told both parties to remain available. And as everyone stood, Madison's attorney grabbed her elbow, not gently. He guided her out like he was afraid she'd do something irreversible in front of the judge. I watched them disappear through the side door. Ms. Patel leaned close and said quietly that if Madison refused the release, we were going to request immediate sanctions and expedited finalization without any pregnancy consideration. I nodded, but my eyes stayed on that door. Because I knew Madison. And I knew she didn't walk into a courtroom with a fake belly unless she thought she could win. Which meant her plan wasn't over. Not yet. Madison didn't come back from recess the way people normally come back. Most people return with their shoulders squared, even if they're losing, because court is one of those places where pride is the last thing you can control. Madison returned with her eyes glossy and her mouth tight, like she'd been chewing something bitter. Her attorney looked worse. The judge called the session back to order and asked, again, for Madison's answer. Consent to the release so the court could verify the documentation directly, yes or no. Madison's attorney tried to speak first, but the judge stopped him. He said he wanted Madison's answer. Madison stared at the table. Her fingers pressed into each other hard enough to blanch the skin. Then she refused. Not loudly. Not with outrage. She refused in a thin voice that tried to sound principled. She claimed it was private. She claimed it was traumatizing. She claimed I was trying to control her body even after the marriage. It was the exact language she used online when she wanted strangers on her side. But the judge didn't react like strangers. He nodded once and said the court would note her refusal. Then he said, plainly, that the court would not consider pregnancy in any support calculation and would proceed based on the existing record. Madison's eyes flashed. She pivoted immediately, attempting to accuse me of something else, trying to regain moral high ground. But the judge cut her off again. This time, his voice sharpened. He said the court had additional concerns. He said the document submitted as proof had irregularities. He said the clinic listed had been contacted by the court clerk before recess and had no record of Madison as a patient. Madison's attorney stiffened. Ms. Patel didn't smile. She didn't need to. Madison's face drained so fast it looked like someone had turned off a light behind it. Then Madison did the thing she always did when she knew she was cornered. She tried to create chaos. She shifted in her chair, breathing harder, pressing her hands to the belly. She made a small noise like she was in pain. It was meant to trigger panic. To make the room forget the paperwork. To make the judge hesitate. But the judge didn't rush forward. He didn't call her dear. He didn't soften. He asked the bailiff to call medical assistance if needed. Then he asked Madison to stand. Not as punishment. As verification. Because real emergencies don't fear clarity. Madison hesitated. Her attorney murmured something urgently. Madison shook her head, like she couldn't. The judge repeated the instruction, still calm. Stand, or the court would treat her behavior as further manipulation. Madison stood. And the belly shifted in a way a body doesn't. It didn't lift with her torso. It didn't move naturally with gravity. It slid slightly, like a strapped-on object adjusting under fabric. There was a small sound, soft but unmistakable, like Velcro catching. Madison's hand flew to her blazer, trying to hold everything in place. But it was too late. The bailiff saw it. The judge saw it. I saw half the courtroom's attention lock onto the same impossible detail at once. For a second, nobody moved, like the room needed permission to believe what it had just witnessed. Then the judge spoke, and his voice had changed completely. He said Madison was in contempt of court. He said she had attempted to materially mislead the court with a false claim designed to influence support. He said her submitted medical documentation appeared fraudulent and would be referred for further review. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. Every word landed like a stamp. Madison's attorney started talking quickly, trying to salvage something, claiming misunderstanding, claiming confusion, claiming his client was under stress. But the judge didn't look at him. He looked at Madison. He said he was granting the divorce on the terms already supported by the record, no increased support, division as outlined in Ms. Patel's proposed settlement, and he was awarding me attorney's fees related to the pregnancy misrepresentation. Then he said something that made Madison's knees visibly soften. He said her conduct would be taken into account if any future claims were brought before the court. That was legal language, but the message was simple. You don't get to come back here and pretend you're the victim again. The bailiff asked Madison to sit. Madison didn't sit gracefully. She lowered herself like someone whose strings had been cut. Her hand stayed on her blazer, trying to hold the lie together. I thought that would be the end of it, the humiliation, the sanctions, the finalization. But Madison wasn't done destroying things on her way down. Because she looked at me again, and the expression in her eyes wasn't fear anymore. It was spite. She said something low, meant for me, not the court. It was the kind of line she used when she wanted to hurt you just enough to keep living in your head. She implied she still had something that could ruin me. And she smiled like she believed it. I didn't answer. Not because I was calm. Because I was suddenly sure she was telling the truth. After court, Ms. Patel and I walked out together. The hallway was loud with the scrape of shoes and murmured conversations, but my head felt quiet, too quiet, like the adrenaline had drained and left behind something heavy. Ms. Patel told me we'd won the most important part. The judge had seen Madison for what she was. The court record would reflect it. The financial damage would be limited. Then she asked me, almost casually, if I wanted to pursue further action about the fraudulent document. I told her yes. Not out of revenge. Out of containment. Because if Madison could fake a pregnancy in a courtroom, she could fake other things too. And I wanted the system to remember her name. 2 days later, the real wow landed. Not in court. In my mailbox. A padded envelope with no return address, postmarked from a nearby town. Inside was a cheap silicone belly pad, the kind used for costumes. And underneath it, folded carefully, was a printed receipt. Date-stamped. Purchased a week before the hearing. Paid with a card. Not Madison's. The last 4 digits were familiar. Because they belonged to my brother. I stood in my kitchen staring at it until my coffee went cold. My brother, Caleb, had been the one person who acted neutral during the divorce. He'd said he didn't want to get involved. He'd said Madison was manipulative, but also that she was still human. He'd told me to settle and move on. I'd believed him because believing him was easier than imagining the alternative. I sent a photo of the receipt to Ms. Patel. She called me immediately. She didn't sound surprised. She sounded like someone who'd just been handed the missing piece of a puzzle she'd already suspected the shape of. She said this could matter in 2 ways. It could support a fraud referral, and it could expose coordination, third-party involvement. I asked her what that meant for me. She told me, bluntly, that it meant I needed to be ready for a different kind of betrayal. The kind that doesn't end with a divorce decree. That night, I went to Caleb's place. I didn't go screaming. I didn't go swinging. I went with the envelope in my jacket, and the calm that comes from knowing the truth is finally heavier than the lie. When he opened the door, he tried to smile. He tried to ask how court went. I didn't answer. I just held out the receipt. And I watched his face do something Madison's face had done in that courtroom: freeze, then scramble, then break. He started talking fast. He claimed it was a misunderstanding. He claimed Madison had asked for help and he didn't think. He claimed he was just trying to keep things from getting ugly. But I could see it in his eyes. It had already been ugly. He just hadn't thought I'd find out. I left without saying what I wanted to say, because words weren't going to undo anything. But I did one thing before I walked away. I took a photo of him holding that receipt. Not to shame him online. Not to ruin him publicly. To document. Because I'd learned the hard way that people like Madison, and people willing to help her, rely on one thing. They rely on you being too exhausted to keep receipts. The divorce finalized the following week. I got the house. I kept my retirement. I paid what was fair and not $1 more. Madison didn't get her payout. She didn't get her narrative. And when she tried to revive it later, posting vague comments about abuse and a corrupt system, it didn't land the same, because the court record existed. Truth has a way of making performative pain look cheap. As for Caleb, I didn't cut him off with a dramatic speech. I just stopped answering. Some betrayals don't deserve closure. They deserve distance. And the only satisfying part of the whole thing, the only part that felt like justice instead of paperwork, was realizing that Madison had walked into court thinking she could control the room with a prop. But the judge only needed one question to collapse her entire act. And once it collapsed, everything underneath it, every alliance, every secret, every backroom deal, started falling out into the light.